Hi class, my name is Dylan Norris, and today I'm going to be talking about social stratification, social structure, and social class.
In this episode, the crew has a question for Captain Bob.
Captain Bob, we all want to ask you something.
Yes, well, what is it?
Why is it that, when we pillage a harbour town, some areas of the town have plenty of magnificent things to liberate, while other parts have nothing?
Yes. Why do some people have more things than other people?
You see, it's like this. Societies rank people based on things like the job you have, the amount of money you make,
Or steal?
the family you belong to, the caste you were born into, the neighborhood you live in, even your accent. When societies rank their members into classes, we call this social stratification. Like the layers of cake. Some classes have more prestige than others.
This has implications for the towns or neighborhoods we rob.
Indeed. That's why we only visit certain towns.
I see. I often wondered why we would pass by some towns that looked undefended.
How long have social classes existed?
There is good evidence for the emergence of social classes with the first civilizations. In Mesopotamia, that took place between 4,500 and 6,000 years ago.
Why do these social classes exist?
One theory is that social classes emerged when a few families gained control of the surplus grain.
The families who had control of the surplus controlled the food.
And of course, if a famine struck, they would be the first to be fed from the surplus.
Some things never change.
As long as there was a surplus of food, not everyone in a society had to be involved in farming. They were free to do other things. Labor specialization emerged.
Labor specialization. You mean people could become house builders, weavers, spinners, artisans,
And bureaucrats.
and bureaucrats?
That's right. Some jobs were more highly valued than others. The further your job was from manual labor, the higher its prestige.
Some things never change. Are there any societies today that don't have social stratification?
There are only a very few. The Jutwanzi are foragers living in the Kalahari Desert in Africa. They live in small bands, and everyone is equal. There are no social classes.
The correlation I'm seeing is that once a society settles down and begins to live in cities, social stratification is inevitable.
That seems to be the case. People began trading for goods and services they could not provide for themselves, and began accumulating possessions. Some families accumulated more stuff than others, and gained prestige in society as a result.
Oh, I see. These individuals and families passed on what they had to future generations, concentrating wealth into the hands of a few groups.
And then we come along and liberate it.
Social stratification refers to a system by which a society ranks categories of people in a hierarchy. In the United States and other developed countries around the world, it is clear that some groups have a greater status, power, and wealth. This hierarchy is known as a social class system and can be defined as a hierarchical division of a society into relatively distinct and homogeneous groups with respects to attitudes, values, and lifestyles. However, pure social classes do not exist in the States or most other industrialized societies, but differences in behaviors can be seen and are different patterns learned from being in specific groups. You can see this flowchart that was found in the book, Figure 4.2 on page 128. Social standing is derived and influences behavior. Socioeconomic factors include occupation, education, ownership, income, and heritage. Social standing includes upper class, middle class, working class, and lower class, but I'll get to those later. And finally, unique behaviors include preferences, purchases, consumption, and communication. This shows that in social standing can influence your behavior and also your spending habits or consumption behaviors, and everything like that. So social structure and social class. Really, there are four main social classes in the United States. The upper class, which makes about 14% of the U.S. population. The middle class, which makes up about 32%. The working class, which makes up about 38%, obviously the largest one. And the lower class, which makes up about 16%. Each one of these classes can actually be broken up into different subclasses. These different subclasses can be based off of Table 4.4 on page 130 of the book, the Coleman-Rainwater Social Class Hierarchy. First, we'll start with the Upper Americans. The Upper Americans can be broken up into three different classes: the upper class, the lower upper class, and the upper middle class. The upper class makes up about 0.3% of Americans and is considered old money. For example, the Kennedys. On the table, the Coleman-Rainwater Social Class Hierarchy, a typical profile would be someone who has a master's degree. A typical occupation would be a board chairman, and a typical income would be about $1.3 million. Next is the lower upper class. This makes up about 1.2% of Americans, and they are called new money. For example, somebody like Steve Jobs or Bill Gates. A typical profile, according to the Coleman-Rainwater Social Class Hierarchy, would be someone with a master's degree, and a certain occupation would be, for example, corporate president, and a typical income would be about $990,000. Next is the upper middle class. This makes up about 12.5% of Americans. They're considered college graduate, managers, and professionals. A certain typical profile for one of these people would be up to a master's or medical degree. An example occupation would be a physician or a higher management position of a large corporation. And a typical income salary would be about $330,000 a year. Next up, we have the middle Americans that can be split up into two different classes, the middle and the working class. The middle class is made up of about 32% of Americans, and there are white-collar workers. This includes office workers, school teachers, and lower-level managers. A typical education would be a college degree, and an income would be about $61,000 a year. The working class is made up of about 38% of Americans, and these are our blue-collar workers. The working class consists of skilled and semi-skilled factory, service, and sales workers. A typical profile for the working class would be someone with a high school diploma, and a typical occupation would be an assembly worker, and an average salary would be about $33,000 per year. The lower Americans can also be split up into two different classes, the upper lower class and the lower class. The upper lower class is made up of about 9% of Americans. They're working, but they're not on welfare. The upper lower class consists of individuals who are poorly educated, have very low incomes, and work as unskilled laborers. Somebody with this typical profile, according to the Coleman-Rainwater Social Class Hierarchy, would have some sort of high school education. A typical occupation would be a janitor, and they would have an income of about $19,700, which puts them close or right at the poverty line. The lower class is made up of about 7% of Americans. They're on welfare, and they're well below the poverty line. Members of the lower social stratum have had low incomes and minimal education. This segment of society is often unemployed for long periods of time and is the major recipient of government support and services provided by non-profit organizations, according to the textbook. A typical profile of one of these Americans would be someone with grade school education. Of course, they are unemployed, and they only make about $10,000 a year, all through government funding. Obviously, with so many different social classes, there's different ways that these Americans will consume products. Businesses need to find a way to market and have a way to reach each different American with different incomes. This is so important in today's business world, and marketing has reached a new spectrum of finding ways to market to each different class. Thank you for your time, and here are my citations.